In under 3 minutes, J.D. Vance said what 300 million Americans have been too afraid to say. It happened in a packed congressional hearing, cameras rolling, lawmakers shifting in their chairs, just moments after Ilhan Omar called the United States a global hypocrite. You could hear a pen drop. And then he spoke. No prepared notes. No performance. Just one sentence. Quiet, searing, and unmistakably true to the people no one had been listening to. What followed didn't just silence the room. It reframed the debate and forced a nation to ask, who speaks for America now? And who's been waiting for someone, anyone, to finally speak for them? This moment, this room, this clash, it's been dramatized. But what you're about to witness is rooted in truths many have lived but few have voiced. The frustration of being dismissed, the dignity of the overlooked, and the fire that still burns in towns left off the maps. The names and events have been shaped for impact, but the emotions they awaken, the questions they stir, those are real and they're ours. So ask yourself, if you were in that room, would you have stood up or sat back down? Stay with us. This isn't just a story. It's a reckoning worth every second. The hearing room was warm, not just from the overhead lights, but from the rising heat of unspoken tensions. A steady hum filled the chamber. Faint murmurs, the low shuffle of documents, the clink of a glass being quietly set down on a polished desk. The kind of sound that told you people were waiting, but not for something routine, for something charged. Cameras were being adjusted quietly along the back wall. A Capitol Hill intern in a blue blazer fumbled with his earpiece, mouthing silent cues from someone backstage. No one was speaking on record yet, but the silence already had a temperature. And then, without fanfare, J.D. Vance entered. No entourage, no announcement. Just the sound of his shoes against the hard wood as he stepped into the room like a man who'd already seen how the story ends. And came anyway. He paused at the doorway, not to be dramatic, but because he always scanned a room first. Not just who was in it, but how they were sitting, who was bracing, who looked too comfortable, who was hiding something beneath still hands. Across the aisle, Ilhan Omar was already seated. She didn't look up. Not yet. Her eyes flicked quickly across her notes, her left thumb rhythmically tapping the edge of a manila folder. The tapping wasn't nervous. It was calculated. Like a metronome. Like a countdown. She wore white, crisp, and unmoving, a statement in itself. Her scarf was wrapped high, neat, almost regal, her lips pressed into a line that could cut. She was ready, not just to speak, but to be quoted. J.D. watched her for one breath too long, then took his seat, 2 rows back, center column. Not quite in frame for the main camera, but close enough to hear everything. A gavel tapped, once, sharp. The chairman, half bored and half aware of how high the stakes were about to rise, cleared his throat and began the formalities. This hearing will come to order. Topic: U.S. foreign aid and moral diplomacy. J.D. tilted his head slightly. Moral diplomacy. It was a phrase that always made him wince, because it usually meant something was about to be justified that had no business being called moral at all. Across the table, Omar adjusted her microphone. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Ilhan Omar for her opening remarks. She smiled, but not the soft kind. The kind that warned you she already knew what she was about to say would make someone uncomfortable. And then she began. Her voice was calm, polished, every syllable deliberate, like a knife slid under velvet. She didn't yell. She didn't pace. She didn't need to. She opened with a quote from a former diplomat, the kind of citation meant to sound wise while delivering a gut punch. And then she said it. American foreign policy, she declared, is built on selective morality backed by strategic self-interest. Not was. His J.D. blinked once. Nothing more. But others shifted. A junior congressman coughed softly. A woman near the front looked down at her phone, not to check the time, but to record. The room didn't erupt. Not yet. That would come later. For now, there was only that sentence, and the tension it planted, like a fuse waiting for someone to strike the match. Somewhere in the back, the red light on the live feed camera blinked on. The hearing had officially begun, and the real story hadn't even started. J.D. didn't flinch, not when Omar mentioned the drone strikes, Not when she cited the list of nations funded by American dollars yet plagued by American weapons. Not even when she accused the country of practicing virtue laundering, a phrase that made the stenographer pause her typing for half a second. He sat still. But inside, a storm had already started. He wasn't offended, he was calculating, because this wasn't about Ilhan Omar. Not really. It was about what her words sounded like to someone who had no choice but to live in the America she just discredited. His fingers rested gently on the table, motionless, but his thoughts moved faster than ever. And suddenly, he wasn't in that hearing room anymore. It was February, southern Ohio, cold enough to make your breath visible, but not cold enough for people to stop showing up for work. He remembered the factory, half lit, half automated, and still somehow full of human noise. Not the kind of noise people complain about, the kind that means life's still fighting to exist. Marianne had been on her feet for 6 hours when JD walked in. She didn't stop working, just nodded once, like she didn't have time for introductions, but was polite enough to acknowledge him. Later on break, they sat on plastic chairs near a broken vending machine. She told him her boy, Danny, had asthma so bad he couldn't sleep through the night. She didn't ask for a handout. She didn't blame anyone. She just said, I don't need politics. I just need to afford the damn inhaler. JD asked her how much she made last month. She looked away, laughed under her breath. Enough to make me ineligible for help, not enough to fix anything. Then she got up and went back to work. Back in the hearing room, JD blinked once and rejoined the present. Omar's voice carried on, sharp, calm, and poetic, a trained cadence, a well-cut rhythm. America, she said now, wears virtue like a costume and forgets the blood underneath. The words echoed, not because they were wrong, but because of who wasn't in the room to answer them. Somewhere in a VA hospital in Pittsburgh, an amputee stared at the hearing on a mounted screen, fork frozen halfway to his mouth. In Tulsa, a single mother of two paused folding laundry to turn up the volume. In Iowa, a trucker idling at a rest stop leaned forward over his steering wheel, eyes narrowing as the words filtered through static. They weren't analysts. They weren't pundits. But they knew what she said didn't feel like accountability. It felt like shame, the kind they'd spent decades carrying. Only now, someone was saying it louder and calling it truth. None of them said anything out loud. But across the country, in living rooms and break rooms and forgotten corners of the map, the same silence settled like dust on wood. And still, JD didn't speak. Not yet. The words were lining up inside him, sharp and loaded, but he held them. Because if you fired too early, no one would listen. But if you waited, really waited, they'd hear you before you even finished. He glanced down once at the table, then back up at Omar, who hadn't paused once. In that moment, JD Vance wasn't just listening, he was choosing where to aim. Ilhan Omar paused for the first time in 20 minutes, not because she was done, but because the silence that followed her words was heavier than the ones she had just spoken. She glanced around the room as if daring someone to interrupt. Then with a composed breath and deliberate clarity, she delivered her final line. To criticize America is not to betray it. It is to love it more truthfully. A few pens scribbled. One aide nodded. Someone from the media pool shifted slightly, fingers already drafting a tweet. The chairman adjusted his glasses but said nothing. No one clapped, but no one challenged her either. Not until the voice came from behind the second row. Mr. Chairman? The words weren't loud, but they cut through the room like a clean break in glass. All heads turned. JD Vance didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. He was already standing. The chairman hesitated. It was clear this wasn't scheduled. JD wasn't listed for formal response. The flow of the hearing didn't call for rebuttal, but the air had changed, and even the chairman could feel it. He glanced once at his counsel, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Mr. Vance, you may proceed. Briefly. JD stepped forward. His suit was plain, his tie slightly loosened. There were no notes in his hands. Just a pen he had no intention of using. For a moment he looked directly at Ilhan Omar. She didn't blink. Then he turned to the chairman, to the committee, to the cameras, and, in some intangible way, to the people who were already watching from far beyond the room. I don't have a prepared speech, he said, voice even, low and grounded, but I have a memory. The sentence landed with unexpected weight. He let it hang. Not long. Just long enough for people to realize this wasn't going to be a political rebuttal. It was something else. Something slower. Personal. Omar sat back slightly, the crease between her brows tightening, not in defensiveness, but in anticipation. JD kept his eyes level. He didn't project like a practiced speaker. He didn't perform. He remembered. And that made everyone lean in. Because when someone chooses memory over rhetoric, you listen. Not because they're polished, but because they might bleed. No one interrupted. No one shuffled papers. The temperature in the room felt like it had dropped 3 degrees. A camera light blinked red again. The stenographer stopped and started twice, unsure whether she was documenting testimony or something heavier. JD opened his mouth to continue, but before a second word could leave his lips, a single line appeared on the screen in stark white letters. The floor went silent. And for the first time in the entire hearing, so did the country. JD Vance didn't speak like a man holding a grudge. He spoke like a man holding a picture in his mind that wouldn't let him go. His voice didn't rise. His tempo didn't shift. But the weight behind every syllable began to build, like quiet water filling a locked chamber, inch by inch until the hinges groaned. I remember driving through Jackson County last winter, he began. You wouldn't know it from a map. It's one of those towns the highway skips. A few members of the committee glanced down at their papers, unsure if this was a speech or a detour, but no one stopped him. She works in that town, Mary Ann. 3 jobs, a mother, been on her feet since 17, never went to college. Not because she didn't want to, because her father had a stroke and somebody had to step up. JD's eyes weren't on his notes. He didn't have any. He was looking at no one in particular, but seeing someone clearly. She pays $800 a month in taxes. I asked her last month what she was hoping to save for. She said, I'm not. I'm just trying to buy insulin for my kid without selling the car. A pause, still calm, still quiet. But in that pause, the room finally realized he wasn't just telling a story. He was aiming it. She doesn't come to D.C., he said. She doesn't speak on panels. She doesn't get profiled in the Atlantic. She doesn't get flown overseas to talk about international values. Then, he looked at Omar. Squarely, no anger, just truth that didn't flinch. But she paid for your microphone. The line didn't shout, but it didn't have to. It echoed, quietly, directly, and with such devastating clarity that it left no room to respond. Omar blinked once, very slowly, her lips pressed together, not defensively, but as if holding something in place. JD didn't move. He let the silence stretch. Not for drama, but because silence was part of the message. The kind of silence that shows you just dropped something too real for anyone to catch. He shifted slightly, grounding himself with 1 foot forward. He wasn't done. You said earlier that to criticize America is to love it more truthfully, he continued. And I don't disagree. But criticism without understanding isn't love. It's projection. A few heads turned toward him now. Not just the audience, the committee. Even the chairman was watching, unmoving. Mary Ann's not asking you to love America with blind eyes. She just wants someone to see her before declaring this country a fraud. He gestured slightly, palm open, not pointing, offering. Because when we talk about morality, we shouldn't forget whose hands we're standing on. That line didn't need to be underlined. The people listening heard it. In offices across the country, in truck cabs, in late-night diners, viewers leaned forward because for the first time, someone wasn't talking about them. He was talking from them. JD inhaled slowly. He had more to say, but for now he let the moment settle. Let them feel what it meant when someone who listened first finally spoke back. Half the room went still, not the kind of stillness that follows applause, but the kind that comes when a truth is spoken out loud and no one's ready for it. One aide seated just off-center behind the committee table fumbled her pen. It clattered against the floor and rolled 3 rows down before anyone thought to pick it up. The microphones didn't buzz. The camera lights didn't blink. But something inside the hearing room had shifted. Something not written into the schedule, not tracked in the minutes, but real enough to make people uneasy in their own posture. JD didn't pause. He didn't soften. He kept going. Look, we can talk about international ethics all day, he said, tone still level, voice steady. But if we can't speak with the same fire about the woman scrubbing hospital floors in Ohio as we do about distant diplomatic partners, then maybe the moral compass is broken before we even lift it. A few lawmakers stirred. A younger representative from the coast leaned into his mic, clearly intending to cut in, but the chairman didn't acknowledge him. Another member lifted a folder and shuffled it unnecessarily. Sound armor against discomfort. JD's eyes moved across the panel, not to intimidate, but to let them know he saw all of it. Every blink, every twitch, every subtle withdrawal. Then came the line. The one that didn't just land, it registered. If patriotism is performative, JD said, then maybe we need more performers and fewer cynics. The sentence came out like a blade sliding from a sheath, slow, smooth, and deliberate. Somewhere in the back, a cough was swallowed. 2 rows behind JD, a man in a navy tie whispered to a colleague, "Did he just call out the whole panel?" Phones began lighting up, not just from reporters in the room, but from staffers who knew this moment wouldn't stay confined to these walls. One aide tapped out a message beneath the table. Timestamp 4832. Cut that quote. Push it to socials. On C-SPAN's live feed, the comment section surged. That line, though. Omar got hit with facts, not feelings. Who is this guy? Outside the building, in a coffee shop in St. Louis, a man stopped mid-pour and replayed the moment twice on his phone. In Jacksonville, a veteran sitting in his truck pulled the stream up on Bluetooth and sat in silence. One hand still on the steering wheel, the other clenched around a coffee cup now gone cold. Inside the chamber, no one had moved in a full 10 seconds. Omar didn't speak, not yet. Her expression remained unreadable, but the stillness in her shoulders had changed. She wasn't relaxed anymore. She was locked in. JD knew exactly what he just said, and exactly what it would cost. He had crossed a line that others preferred to dance around. He hadn't suggested reform. He hadn't proposed nuance. He had made a choice to defend the people who rarely make the cut in these rooms, to remind the room that conviction wasn't the same thing as conflict, and that sometimes it takes performance to make truth visible again. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because sometimes clarity speaks louder than volume. And at that moment, JD Vance was the clearest voice in the room. By the time JD Vance returned to his seat, the internet had already exploded. The line, "She paid for your microphone," was clipped, subtitled, and tweeted out by 3 congressional staffers within 60 seconds. In less than 5 minutes, it had migrated to Facebook. In 8, TikTok. By the 10-minute mark, a verified account had turned it into a remix, overlaying JD's words with military drums and grainy footage of Rust Belt towns. The committee hearing hadn't adjourned. The panel hadn't even moved on to the next speaker. But the story, the one people would remember, had already escaped the building. JD sat silently now, not checking his phone, not looking at the red recording light that still pulsed at the edge of the chamber. But across the country, from barbershops to airport lounges, the moment was already being watched on loop. Cable news caught up fast. On MSNBC, the headline read, "Vance clashes with Omar over morality and American policy." On Fox, Vance delivers blistering defense of the forgotten American. CNN hosted a split-screen debate within the hour, one anchor visibly moved, another visibly uncomfortable. "He's being applauded for appealing to emotion," said one guest analyst, pushing up her glasses. "But let's be clear, this is rhetoric, not policy," another shot back. "Sometimes rhetoric is exactly what wakes a sleeping country. This wasn't just political, it was personal." Out in Dayton, a Rust Belt radio host cut into his usual afternoon playlist to replay the clip twice. No sound effects, no commentary, just the audio of JD's line, followed by a long pause. When he came back on, his voice was low, almost reverent. "That," he said, "was the speech we didn't know we needed." Callers lit up the board. A trucker from Indiana said he pulled over just to replay it. A nurse from Erie said it made her cry on her lunch break. A retired vet from Kansas said he hadn't heard anyone in D.C. speak like that in 30 years. Meanwhile, the video hit 1 million views in under an hour. Ilhan Omar remained seated in the hearing room. She didn't respond. Not out loud, but her posture had changed. Her hands, once relaxed and composed on the table, now clasped tightly together. She looked to the side once, not at JD but toward the press row, then quickly looked back down at her notes. It wasn't the kind of irritation you show when someone gets under your skin. It was the kind you bury, because you know the reaction would only fuel it. But she knew what was happening. The moment was no longer hers. She had spoken first, spoken sharply and spoken well. But JD had said less, and somehow said more. His line was already being stitched into Twitter bios. It was quoted in text threads between fathers and sons. It was being printed on t-shirts before the committee even recessed. A staffer leaned in and whispered something to Omar. She didn't respond, just nodded slightly. The kind of nod that meant noted, not defeated. And still, JD said nothing. He didn't have to. Because in an era that often rewards volume, something rare had just happened. A quiet voice had gone louder than the noise, and America, bruised and busy as ever, was finally listening. By morning, the number had passed 9.2 million. JD hadn't even checked. He didn't need to. The knock on his office door at 6:47 a.m. told him enough. "Congressman," his chief of staff said, holding up a tablet, "it's everywhere." The screen was a mosaic of headlines, thumbnails, and live counters. Mic drop moment from JD Vance shakes House hearing. Fox, populist rhetoric or genuine outcry? JD Vance goes viral. CNN, dangerous and deliberate. The rise of a nativist voice. Vox JD blinked once, took the tablet, and set it face down on the desk without looking. He stared out the window instead. Fog clung to the corners of the Capitol dome. A janitor pushed a cart quietly down the sidewalk. The world was awake, but not yet noisy. "It's trending in 5 countries, his staffer continued. Top 3 clips on Twitter. It even hit TikTok twice. They're remixing it over Springsteen." JD let out a dry breath. Not quite a laugh, more like air escaping from a tire. "This wasn't for press," he said flatly. "But press found it anyway," she replied, lowering her voice. "And now they want you on camera." There were requests lined up. Meet the Press, Face the Nation, Morning Joe, Tucker Carlson, a Sunday night slot on CNN, a podcast with 500,000 weekly listeners. Each one came with a question waiting to be asked. Was it planned? Was it theater? Are you the new face of something you're not yet ready to admit? JD shook his head. "Tell them no, all of them." The aide hesitated. "Even PBS?" He turned toward her finally. "Especially PBS." She gave a small smile, then left the room. The backlash began before noon. Progressive pundits labeled his speech aggressive populism draped in anecdote. One columnist called it weaponized sympathy. Another accused him of masking resentment in working-class costume. A prominent political podcast spent 22 minutes dissecting the tone of his voice, the squint of his eyes, the length of his pause before looking at Omar. The Atlantic posted a think piece by noon, "When Real Americans Become a Threat." JD read none of it. He sat in the corner of his office, alone, drinking lukewarm coffee and replaying the moment, not on video, but in memory. Mary Ann's face, her boy's name, the quiet fury behind that one sentence. "She paid for your microphone." The line had hit harder than even he expected. Not because it was rehearsed, it wasn't, but because the truth had been sharpened over time, in towns without airports, where nobody watched C-SPAN unless they were on night shift and too tired to sleep. He wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to break the cycle of polite silence. But now he was being cast into a role he hadn't auditioned for. Patriot hero to some, nationalist threat to others. His phone buzzed again. A message from an old friend. "Man, you just became the conversation. Be ready. They're coming for you from both sides." JD didn't reply. He stood slowly, walked to the window and pressed his palm lightly against the glass. Outside, a group of tourists snapped photos of the Capitol. He wondered how many of them had watched the clip, how many had felt it, and how many had decided, within 10 seconds, whether he was a villain or a vessel. He didn't regret what he said, but he knew the country wouldn't let him say it quietly again. By the end of the week, the noise had taken on a new shape. What began as applause and outrage had curdled into something colder, more calculated. The messages came faster now, not just comments, but calls. Not just calls, but threats. The congressional security team flagged 3 emails that mentioned JD's home address. One of them included a photo of his wife at the grocery store, taken without her knowledge. Another referenced his son's school. The threats weren't dramatic. They were quiet, the kind that sounded calm enough to feel real, the kind written by people who didn't need to scream to mean it. JD was briefed by Capitol Police. They advised his family to stay off social media, to vary their routes, to ignore the noise, until it wasn't just noise anymore. He called home that night. His wife answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, but her sentences were short. She didn't talk about the article. She didn't talk about the threats. She just asked if he was okay. And then, after a pause, added softly, "Don't come back different." JD sat in the dark after that. No TV, no aides, just him and the faint glow of his office monitor, screen blank. For once, he wasn't trying to craft a response. He wasn't thinking about political consequences. He was wondering when the truth became something you had to pay for. His phone vibrated once more. A voicemail. He played it without checking the number. The voice was weathered. Male, older, slight rasp, but clear. "You're the first one who didn't flinch." Short breath. "I served in 71. Been waiting 50 years for someone to say what you said. So, thank you." The line clicked. That was it. No name. No callback number. Just that. JD leaned back, letting the silence swell around him. He closed his eyes, and in the space between blinks, a memory rose uninvited. His grandfather never said much. A steelworker with broad hands and a bad hip, the man rarely spoke at family dinners, never offered unsolicited opinions, and sat through church like a statue, silent, respectful, unmoved. But when the national anthem played, he stood. Always. Even when his knee went out. Even when no one else in the room bothered to follow. JD used to wonder why. It wasn't performative. It wasn't proud. It was stubborn. The kind of standing that came from knowing what it cost other people to do so. He remembered one Sunday, JD was 12. A visiting preacher delivered a fiery sermon condemning the direction of this country. People nodded. Some clapped. But his grandfather didn't. He didn't argue. Didn't nod. Just stood during the final hymn, eyes fixed on the stained glass window, hand over heart like he was saying the pledge in silence. Afterward, JD asked him if he agreed with the preacher. The old man had looked down at him and said, "You can fix something without spitting on it first." JD never forgot that line. Back in his office, the light from the hallway crept in under the door. The silence was heavy, but not unbearable. It felt like a weight meant to be carried, not avoided. He didn't regret what he'd said, but he understood now what came with saying it. Truth once spoken doesn't disappear. It lingers, and sometimes it leaves a mark on the speaker before it ever reaches the world. He hadn't planned on driving back to Jackson County. It wasn't on the calendar, and he didn't alert his staff. He didn't bring a camera crew or a local journalist, just took the highway south and let the fields flatten out around him, hour by hour, until the city noise faded into power lines and telephone poles and hills that had learned to hold quiet things. The road was familiar, too familiar. He knew every gas station that had closed, every diner that served reheated coffee with too much sincerity. These weren't places built for politics. They were built for people who didn't have time to explain why they were still standing. JD parked behind the old strip mall and walked around the back entrance to the factory. He didn't need to ask if Marianne was on shift. He could hear her voice above the machines, calling orders, moving parts, steady and efficient like she always was. He waited in the break room, sipping burnt coffee and avoiding the news ticker scrolling silently on the mounted screen above the vending machine. She came in 10 minutes later, wiped her hands on her apron, raised an eyebrow. "You here for more campaign footage?" she asked, not unkindly, just tired. JD shook his head. "Just here." She studied him a moment, then sat. "I saw the clip," she said. "Danny saw it first. I don't really get Twitter, but it made it to Facebook, so you know it's real." JD gave a faint smile, but his eyes were distant. He didn't want to talk about views or comments or trending moments. He wanted to ask her something much harder. "Was it too much?" he asked softly. "What I said, the way I said it." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You said what was true. That's not too much. That's too rare. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. The edges were frayed. The writing was uneven. He wanted you to have this. JD took it slowly, unfolded it carefully like it might tear just from being open. In blocky handwriting, the note read, he saw you on YouTube. He said I'm strong. First time I believed it. Danny JD stared at the page longer than he meant to. The words weren't poetic, but they were clean, unfiltered, unforced. The kind of sentence that only exists before the world teaches you how to water it down. He folded the note once, twice, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat without saying a word. Marianne didn't say anything either. She just looked at him, not like a politician, not like a news clip, like a man who carried something heavy and finally realized someone had noticed. JD stood, nodded once, and turned to leave. He didn't make promises, didn't offer speeches, just paused at the door, looked back, and said the only thing that felt honest. Tell him I read it. She smiled. He'll know. Outside, the air had cooled. The clouds were breaking up in slow, thin streaks. JD walked back to his car without checking his phone, without thinking about the headlines waiting for him when he got back. The note was still there, pressed against his chest just beneath the fabric. And for the first time in days, he stopped wondering whether it had been worth it. Because sometimes belief doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the smallest one finally saying, I believe it too. It didn't take long for the applause to curdle into criticism. By Monday morning, the narrative had fractured. What had started as a viral moment was now being dissected, diluted, and slowly discredited by the national media cycle. JD's words were no longer replayed in full. They were clipped, contextualized, then cross-examined by people who had never stepped foot in Jackson County or waited in line at a rural clinic with a child wheezing through a paper mask. CNN opened their morning segment with the headline, Vance promotes isolationist rage disguised as empathy. A panel of experts, 2 former diplomats, 1 best-selling author, and a former campaign strategist, debated whether JD's speech was a populist stunt or a genuine appeal wrapped in dangerous rhetoric. One guest smirked as they compared JD's storytelling technique to the angry mythology of the Rust Belt. Across the dial, the view lit into him with scripted outrage. One co-host rolled her eyes while another mocked his tone. I mean, she paid for your microphone? Okay, JD, and what did you pay for? Twitter blue check validation? Laughter followed, as did a mocking applause track added in post for the online cut. JD's face, frozen mid-sentence, was used as a backdrop while the panel moved on to discuss Taylor Swift's next album. Later that afternoon, Ilhan Omar appeared on MSNBC, perfectly lit, perfectly poised, and in complete control of the room. She didn't mention JD by name, but she didn't have to. The words were sharp enough without a direct target. We must rise above performative speeches, she said, and focus on healing. America deserves more than theatrics. It deserves truth backed by action, not applause. The clip was clean, polished, and instantly shareable. Within hours, it was retweeted by dozens of progressive lawmakers and activists, accompanied by hashtags like #RealLeadership and #BeyondPerformance. JD's name didn't trend that day, but his silence did. What stung more than the pundits, though, was the shift from within. Some of JD's own colleagues, people he'd stood beside on the floor, people who had praised his clarity in private, began to back away in public. A moderate from Pennsylvania issued a vague tweet about the dangers of oversimplified outrage. A senator from the Midwest, once photographed visiting JD's district, told Politico, "We can't afford rhetoric that stirs pain without offering real policy solutions." It was political distancing in real time, surgical and safe. Even inside his own staff, the mood began to change. One aide suggested they pivot messaging toward a jobs-first economic policy, quietly pushing JD's viral moment to the side. Another recommended declining further interviews, citing message fatigue among swing state independents. JD said nothing. He just sat in his office listening, not to the cable news loop or the podcast commentary, but to the sound of something deeper, the quiet tick of a narrative being rewritten without his consent. What had started as a story of truth had become a headline war. He could feel it happening in real time. The reframing, the weaponization of nuance, the slow transformation of his moment into something it never was. He wasn't a victim. He didn't need sympathy. But for the first time since the hearing, he realized something essential. The country had heard what he said. Now it was deciding what version of him it wanted to remember. The hit pieces came fast, and they came surgically. The same line that had electrified the country just days earlier, "She paid for your microphone," was now spliced, stripped of its context, and looped alongside graphics, commentary, and headlines that rewrote its meaning. One clip, posted by a well-known progressive blog, cut JD's speech in half, bookending it with ominous music and grainy slow-motion zooms. It framed him as channeling old-school nationalism, with a quote bubble above his head that read, "Real Americans only," a phrase he never said. Another piece from a major news magazine included a side-by-side comparison. JD's line on patriotism next to a quote from a 1930s populist demagogue, suggesting echoes that weren't there, but felt dangerous once juxtaposed. The framing was clear: charisma without caution, passion without policy, a man who delivered heat but not light. Some in the media didn't have to say it. They simply showed it, enough times for repetition to do its quiet damage. Inside JD's office, his team debated what to do. Some suggested releasing a press statement. Others proposed writing an op-ed for a neutral outlet. But JD didn't want edits, didn't want consultants. He wanted clarity, raw, director, unfiltered. So he turned off the lights, closed the blinds, pulled out his phone, and hit record. No backdrop, no prep. Just a man in a darkened room, the glow of his desk lamp cutting across his face. He spoke slowly. One take, no retakes. "I've heard the headlines, I've seen the edits, but I don't regret what I said. Not a single word. Because I wasn't speaking to pundits or podcasts. I was speaking to someone who's been forgotten. She works 3 jobs. She still pays her taxes. She's not famous. She's not invited to panels. But she paid for your microphone. She paid for mine. All I asked was this: don't shame her for doing it." He ended the video with no sign-off, no call to action, just a short, steady pause before he clicked to stop. The clip was 90 seconds long. He uploaded it without caption. Just let it live, untethered, on his personal feed. At first, the response was muted. No viral explosion, no blue-check endorsements. But then, something else began to happen. A small veterans forum on Facebook shared it with the caption, "Finally, someone said it without apologizing." A steelworkers union page reposted it the next day. Then a page for EMTs. Then a closed group for military wives. Then a local volunteer fire department in Pennsylvania. It didn't trend. It circulated. Within 72 hours, the video had quietly reached over 600,000 views, most of them through shares, not algorithms. The comment sections weren't full of flame wars. They were full of nods. "That's what my dad used to say. Reminds me of home. About time someone talked to us instead of around us." JD didn't post a follow-up. He didn't need to. He knew the big platforms would ignore it. Knew the roundtable shows would move on. Knew some doors were already quietly closing behind him. But he also knew this. For the first time since the hearing, people had stopped talking about what he said and started remembering why he said it. And in a war of narratives, sometimes the quietest message is the one that refuses to disappear. It started with one letter, a worn envelope, no return address, just a smudged postmark from Ohio. Inside was a short note in uneven handwriting. "My son heard you speak." He looked up from his cereal and said, "Mom, is he talking about us?" "You were." Then came the second, and the third, and then they didn't stop. By the end of the week, JD's office, usually orderly, quiet, predictable, looked like a scene from another era. Stacks of mail spilled across desks and filing cabinets. Envelopes with return addresses from places that rarely made the news. Millersville, Arkansas, Dulce, New Mexico, Braga County, Michigan. Places JD had never set foot in. Places no cable panel would mention. places that suddenly had something to say. A school principal from West Virginia enclosed a photo of her sixth-grade civics class, each kid holding up a handmade sign with a word they chose: honor, grit, belonging. Heard, she wrote simply, "We played your speech." Then I told them, "This is what remembering looks like." One letter was written in pencil on ruled paper, in tight, hesitant strokes. It came from a teenage boy in Nebraska. He said he'd watched the clip with his father, a long-haul trucker. He hasn't cried since Grandma died, but he did last night, just once. He wiped his face and said, "Somebody finally said it out loud. I just wanted to tell you that." Some were angry, not at JD, but at what they felt had been stolen from them. A nurse from Mississippi wrote, "I don't need a party. I need someone to stop pretending my sacrifice is hypothetical." A former steelworker from Erie, Pennsylvania, "You didn't speak like a politician. You spoke like someone who still walks through a grocery store like the rest of us." The most unexpected package came from Kansas. No letter, just a folded American flag, neatly pressed, and a Purple Heart ribbon tucked inside. JD opened it slowly, confused. Taped to the inside flap was a small, square note. 7 words. "Keep it. You earned it more than they'll admit." JD didn't know what to do with it at first. He held the ribbon in his hand for a long time. It was frayed slightly at the edge. Real, not symbolic, not purchased. And then came the call, a quiet voicemail from a woman who didn't leave her name. Her voice was raspy, almost embarrassed. I'm not one to reach out, but my husband passed last year. Military funeral. You said something about people paying for microphones. He would have stood up and clapped. He would have liked you." No hashtags, no trending topics, just names, just lives. Some of the letters never reached his hands. His staff, overwhelmed, began pinning a few to the office wall, then a few more. Soon they covered the west side of the room. One aide started calling it the real gallery. Another quietly brought in a coffee tin labeled "Letters that weren't meant for anyone but him." Steve would come in early sometimes, before the meetings, before the noise. He'd pick one at random, unfold it, and read. Not always out loud, not always fully, sometimes just a line. One was signed in crayon, "Thank you for seeing my mom." He never responded publicly. He didn't need to, because something had changed. The hearing may have ended. The cameras may have turned away. But for thousands of people who never imagined anyone in power might speak for them, something had opened, and it didn't feel like politics. It felt like being seen. And once seen, you don't go back to silence. You wait, you watch, and this time, you answer. The wind carried grit through the hollow bones of the steel town. JD Vance stepped out of his rental car and looked up at what once was the towering shell of an abandoned mill. Corroded beams clawing at the sky, broken windows like the empty eyes of a giant that forgot how to dream. The air smelled of rust and memory. No tour, no cameras, just JD, a thin scarf against the Ohio chill, walking slowly past what remained of a forgotten backbone. The fence that once marked the factory's perimeter now wore different armor, handmade signs, wood planks, cardboard scraps, spray paint on steel sheets, all bearing the same quote. "We're not a punchline, we're the spine." JD Vance. Some signs were neat, calligraphed with care. Others were scrawled in a child's handwriting, bold and wobbly. On one, someone had drawn a cracked flag, one stripe missing, replaced with the word respect. A local man, gray beard, welding jacket, hands like tools, stood silently as JD approached. He didn't say hello, just pointed with his chin at the fence. "You didn't build those," the man said. "We did." JD nodded once, eyes scanning the names scribbled in corners. Hazelton Crew, Carrie and Joe, Line 7, to Dad. These weren't slogans for TV. They were stitched from pain, labor, and a quiet dignity that never got its microphone. "We didn't think anyone in DC saw us," the man added. "You said one sentence. That's all it took." A gust of wind snapped one of the signs loose. JD caught it before it hit the ground. On the back, written in Sharpie, He made my brother cry. First time since the deployment, no signature. He folded it gently and placed it in his coat pocket next to Marianne's son's note. They walked together to the back of the fence where the steel frame curved toward a view of the river. There, hung alone on chain link, was a faded ribbon, purple. JD recognized it instantly. It was the same one the veteran from Kansas had sent. Someone had laminated it in plastic, pinned it carefully in place. No plaque, just a short sentence underneath. For those who fight without armor. JD felt the weight of it. Not pride, not ego, something deeper, like standing in a chapel that only ghosts attend. He turned to the welder. How long has this been here? Since 3 nights after that hearing, the man said. People started coming on their own, leaving things, stories, patches. One guy even left a boot. JD said nothing. He didn't need to. Some truths didn't live in speeches. They lived in fences like this, quiet, scarred, sacred. And as he turned to leave, another car pulled up. A teenage girl stepped out, holding something wrapped in cloth. She looked nervous, almost embarrassed. I watched the clip with my mom, she said. She never talks politics, but that night, she cried. She handed him the bundle. It was a lunch pail, her grandfather's. Inside was a folded photograph of a Union strike, dated 1974. Dozens of men with fists raised and helmets dented. JD clutched it like it was glass. Take it to Washington, she said. They won't remember us, but maybe they'll remember this. He nodded, throat tight, and walked back to his car, leaving the rusted wall behind, but carrying it with him all the same. The classroom walls were lined with faded maps and handwritten essays, the kind pinned up with more hope than grating precision. A paper eagle dangled from the ceiling, one wing torn. In the far corner, a small TV cart flickered to life, grainy footage loading from YouTube. JD's voice filled the room, calm, deliberate, unplanned. She paid for your microphone. The kids, middle schoolers from a steel town whose factory closed before most of them were born, watched without blinking, not because the video was loud, but because it was real. No sound effects, no background music, just the voice of someone who sounded angry for the right reasons. A boy in a worn hoodie raised his hand, not waiting to be called on. Is he a hero? The teacher smiled, then paused, eyes scanning the screen where JD leaned forward, eyes sharp but steady. No, she said finally, just someone who didn't stay quiet. There was a silence that followed, not awkward, not empty, the kind that fills a room when a truth has landed. The class wasn't sure what to do with that answer. Heroes wore capes, saved cities, and flew. This guy wore a suit, stood still, and talked about insulin. That's it? The boy asked again. The teacher stepped closer to the TV, her reflection merging with JD's image on the screen. That's the thing, Gabe. Sometimes the people who don't wear a title carry the weight of those who can't. From her desk drawer, she pulled out a worn envelope. Inside was a letter, copied and laminated. She held it up. The words of a veteran from Kansas, the same letter JD had read aloud weeks earlier. She had printed dozens, gave them out every year before finals. The words read, I didn't fight for applause. I fought so someone could speak up when the rest forgot we mattered. The kids didn't say anything for a long while. A girl near the back slid her phone out to record the clip. She whispered to her friend, I'm sending this to my uncle. He served, he'll like it. At the end of the period when the bell rang, only half the students stood up. The rest lingered, eyes still on the screen, as JD's final line played again. If patriotism is performative, then maybe we need more performers and fewer cynics. Outside, leaves blew across the schoolyard. JD stood by the flagpole, unnoticed, watching from a distance. He hadn't announced he was visiting. He didn't enter, just watched. He saw the teacher step out. She didn't recognize him at first. You're early, she said to him casually, assuming he was someone's dad. He half smiled. Just passing through. You look familiar. JD pointed to the window behind her. That class, they still ask questions? She tilted her head, then caught the trace in his eyes. All the right one, she said, especially when the answers don't come easy. JD looked down at his hands. No notes, no cameras, no ribbon. Just the echo of a conversation he wasn't supposed to start, still rippling through walls no one had planned to shake. He turned to leave, but the teacher called after him. "If they ask who you are, what should I say?" He paused, looked at the building, then the flag, then the cracked sidewalk under his boots. "Just tell them I was listening." And with that, he walked down the steps, blending into the quiet, the kind of quiet that meant something had been said and heard. They didn't start with a plan. It began with one letter, then two, then 35, then a box from Kansas, stuffed with envelopes bound in twine, some typed, many handwritten, and one that had a coffee ring right where the sender had underlined, "You saw us." By the end of the week, JD's team stopped using the mailroom. They cleared a wall in the back office, formerly a whiteboard covered in policy notes, and rolled out a map the size of a barn door. JD said nothing when they pinned the first town, Hollow Ridge, Ohio. He simply nodded and walked away. But when the fourth town was added, Wheatland, Wyoming, he returned that evening and stayed for hours. By the end of the month, the map had so many pins it looked like a constellation chart of forgotten places. Aides started calling it the Real America Wall. Each morning, before the first meeting, JD stood in front of it. Not in prayer, not for show, just stood, quiet, as if those towns were speaking back. Some towns were nothing more than dots on a highway. Others had names that sounded more like stories than locations. Dogwood Bend, Liberty Hollow, Mineral Point. One pin, barely noticeable near the bottom edge, marked Junction, Mississippi. That envelope had held only one sentence. This time it didn't feel like we whispered into the void. JD touched that pin more than once, always gently, like it might fall if he pressed too hard. One afternoon, an aide entered with a fresh bundle of mail. "This one's from a high school in Arizona," she said, laying the stack on the table. JD didn't respond. His eyes were locked on a new edition, Prescott, Michigan. A boy there had written, "My grandfather watched your hearing. He said you reminded him of his war captain, firm, tired, and unafraid." On the opposite side of the room, a glass case had been installed. Inside, resting on a black velvet cloth, was the Purple Heart ribbon sent by the disabled veteran from Kansas. JD had tried to return it twice. Both times the reply was the same. "You earned it in a different war. Keep it visible." And so he had. Now every visitor who entered his office saw it. Few asked about it. Fewer still understood. But once a reporter broke the silence. "What battle was this from?" JD didn't blink. The kind that leaves no scars on the outside. As dusk approached one evening, JD stood before the wall again. No cameras, no audience, just the hum of a desk fan and the faint tapping of a loose window pane. He reached up and adjusted the pin at Middle Creek, Kentucky, a letter written in pencil from a mother of four who'd said, "We never had a senator come here, but we had your words. That was enough." He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply placed a palm flat against the map over Middle Creek and left it there. Behind him, a staffer quietly whispered, "They'll write again." JD nodded once, still facing the map. "Then we'll keep making space," he replied. It came in a beige envelope. No watermark, no fanfare. Just a name typed in clean serif font, Senator J.D. Vance, room 316. Inside, a folded note with 3 lines. Private policy session. International aid and accountability. Attendance required. J.D. read it twice, then once more. His chief of staff hovered just outside the door, hesitant. "She'll be there," he finally said. J.D. didn't ask who. He already knew. The next morning before sunrise, the office buzzed with quiet unease. One aide paced. Another offered to call and cancel. "Say there's a scheduling conflict." J.D. shook his head. "Some rooms you walk into not because you're ready," he said, adjusting his tie, "but because they thought you wouldn't." The room was in the Capitol's southeast wing, behind a door that looked like it hadn't been opened since the Truman era. When J.D. stepped in, the space felt less like a meeting room and more like a waiting room for truths no one wanted aired. 10 people, no cameras, no aides, just water pitchers, yellow notepads, and nameplates that meant power. Ilhan Omar sat at the end of the U-shaped table, her posture calm, spine straight, fingers steepled. She didn't look up. JD took the seat directly across from her. The moderator, a former ambassador with hair like unfinished snow, opened the folder and cleared his throat. Let's discuss where the dollars go and what they say when they get there. The first 30 minutes were procedural: trade routes, NGO compliance, procurement audits. Then the shift came, so slight you'd miss it if you weren't listening for it. Omar leaned forward. Every year, we send over $50 billion to causes we barely audit, in countries most Americans couldn't find on a map, she said. If morality is the currency, shouldn't we first look at who's printing it? JD didn't flinch, but his fingers pressed just a little firmer against the notepad. Another senator tried to pivot. Let's stay focused on logistical efficiency. Omar kept going, her voice low, deliberate. You know what I told a refugee aid worker in Lebanon last year? She asked. That America often shows up with good intentions and armed contradictions. JD met her eyes. What did they say? They said that honesty is a luxury the powerful call radical. A pause lingered. The room held its breath. Then JD spoke. You believe my patriotism is naive. I believe your outrage is selective. But I think we both know something's broken, and neither of us wants to lie about it anymore. Omar didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded once, the kind of nod that said finally, not agree. Another senator whispered to the moderator, who scribbled notes furiously. The air in the room was thick, but not hostile. More like clay, soft enough to mold, heavy enough to weigh down every word. At the close of the session, as chairs scraped quietly against the floor, Omar stood first. JD rose after. For a split second, their eyes met again, not as combatants, but as co-keepers of a conversation most rooms never survived. In the hallway, JD's aide caught up with him. How'd it go? JD looked back once, or saw the door close behind Omar. She came to speak truth, he said, not war. This time, maybe I did too. The room had emptied, but the weight remained. Outside, voices faded behind velvet curtains. Inside, it was just the two of them. JD, standing by the long walnut table, Ilhan Omar by the window, arms crossed, gaze distant. She didn't speak immediately. Then, without turning, her voice cut through the quiet. You realize what you did out there wasn't just political, she said. You turned a policy hearing into a theater of division. JD remained still. The tone wasn't explosive. It was restrained, sharp, and personal. He let it settle before answering. I didn't aim for division, he said. I aimed for recognition. Now she turned, her eyes fierce, not with hatred, but with disappointment. You aimed for applause, she replied. And you got it. But at what cost? You've made it harder for any of us to speak without getting shouted down. JD didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small, wrinkled note, the same one Marianne's son had written. He glanced at it, then looked back at her. I told the truth of a woman who works 3 jobs and still can't buy insulin, he said. That's not theater. That's her life. Ilhan's expression didn't soften, but something behind her eyes shifted. She stepped forward slowly, measured. I'm not your enemy, JD, she said quietly. But when you speak like the whole world is broken and only your side sees it, people like me become your symbol of what's wrong. JD took a breath. And when you say America's moral compass is hypocrisy in a suit, you're not just speaking truth to power. You're bruising the people who carry the weight without the paycheck. He moved to the side of the room, ran his hand along the worn edges of the mahogany table. You have your truths, he said. I have mine. But the people between us, they don't care who wins the mic. They care who shows up when the lights go off. She folded her arms tighter. You mean well, she said. But your story isn't the only one that matters. JD nodded slowly. And yours isn't either. That's why I'm here. Not to erase yours, but to remind this town that we're talking about people, not points. A long silence. No one moved. The tension wasn't broken, but it shifted. Now it felt less like a standoff and more like a summit. 2 sides of the same wound, held in an uneasy truce. Ilhan spoke again, this time softer. If only the country saw this conversation, not just the clips. JD smiled faintly, more weariness than pride. They'll see what they want to see, he said, But maybe a few will see what they need to. From the hallway, distant footsteps grew louder. The spell broke. The quiet folded back into the machine of politics. Ilhan reached for her bag. JD looked down at the note one last time before slipping it back into his pocket. As she reached the door, she paused. "I hope that boy gets his insulin," she said. JD nodded. He did, but what he really got was to see his mom as more than tired. The door closed behind her. JD stood alone for a moment longer, surrounded by the echo of words that wouldn't make headlines, but might outlast them. The door clicked shut behind Ilhan Omar, and the air in the room exhaled with her exit. No handshake had been exchanged, no apology given. Yet something intangible had shifted, a small tremor beneath years of concrete assumptions. JD stood still, the room now echoing only with the soft tick of a distant wall clock and the quiet shuffle of a lone staffer collecting empty coffee cups. Across the table, her chair sat slightly askew, as if the argument still lingered there, sitting without words. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded note again, feeling the creases. The weight of it wasn't paper, it was the reality behind the words. And now the absence of shouting between them carried more charge than any debate he'd ever stood in. Down the hallway, Omar walked alone. Her posture wasn't rigid, but reflective. She didn't check her phone, didn't glance at the reporters hovering near the far exit. She just kept walking, one step in front of the other, the same way the country she served moved, slow, divided, but somehow forward. From the side doorway, a junior staffer who had been watching the entire exchange from the shadows stepped forward. She was young, maybe in her 20s, clipboard still in hand, eyes wide, not with admiration, but quiet revelation. She looked at JD and said half-whisper, "That's what courage looks like now, isn't it?" JD raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Not screaming," she added, "showing up." He didn't respond with a speech. He just gave her a nod, then walked toward the window and looked out over the Capitol dome. Rain clouds were building in the distance, thick, slow, and gray, but there was a strange beauty in how they rolled. The staffer lingered a moment longer, then returned to her task. Even she seemed to move differently now, as if silence too could be a form of momentum. Downstairs, the press had already started spinning fragments of the exchange. Vance and Omar face off. No reconciliation, another day of division. But none of them had stayed long enough to see what actually happened when the cameras went off. No viral clip would capture that she hadn't rolled her eyes, that he hadn't raised his voice, that for 10 minutes, two people on opposite ends of belief simply sat in a room and saw each other, barely but truly. JD stepped back from the window and sat down again. The chair across from him still held heat from her presence. He reached for the notepad in front of him and wrote one sentence across the top. Sometimes a bridge doesn't begin with a handshake, just a nod that says, "I stayed." He looked at the sentence for a long moment, then tore the page out and placed it beside the note from Marianne's son. No headlines, no fireworks, just a fragile thread across a widening chasm, one that might hold if enough people decided not to let go. The bell had already rung, but no one moved. In the civics classroom of a modest public high school tucked just outside Dayton, Ohio, time felt momentarily suspended. Dust floated in the golden light cutting through half-open blinds, and the faint buzz of an old ceiling fan stirred the quiet. On the whiteboard at the front of the room, someone had written in large blue marker, "She paid for your microphone." The sentence just sat there, unexplained, raw, alive. A cluster of students stared at it, confused but curious. Some leaned forward, a few leaned back, folding their arms, waiting for someone else to speak first. In the second row, a girl with her hoodie pulled tight around her face finally broke the silence. "That line," she said quietly, "that felt like my mom." No one laughed. The teacher, Ms. Caldwell, early 40s, steady voice, stepped forward and nodded. "It was said by a senator in a hearing, not long ago." She clicked the old projector remote, and the video began to play. The room filled with the clear, low timbre of J.D. Vance's voice. No background music, no edits. Just his words, calm and unscripted, echoing in the classroom. 3 jobs, $800 in taxes last month, and she still can't afford her son's insulin. Then the line came again. Now not just ink on a board, but spoken truth. She doesn't get invited to panels, but she paid for your microphone. The clip ended. No one clapped, but something in the room had shifted, an invisible understanding threading its way through kids who'd never set foot in a congressional chamber, but knew exactly what it meant to be unseen. From the back row, a boy raised his hand. Is he like a hero or something? Ms. Caldwell paused. Her answer didn't come with grandeur, just quiet weight. No, she said gently, just someone who didn't stay quiet. The class nodded, not in unison, but in thought, as if realizing that silence too was a kind of choice, and that someone somewhere finally chose to speak with them, not about them. On the whiteboard, the words remained. She paid for your microphone. By the end of class, no one had erased it. The town was small, one of those places most maps reduced to a dot with no label. But on this late afternoon, it felt like the center of something larger. At the edge of the park near the elementary school, a new wall had been built, not of marble or granite, but of reclaimed steel and local stone, scarred, weathered, real. Names were etched by hand into the surface. No titles, no ranks, just names. Angela Reyes, waitress. Derek Tompkins, janitor. Evelyn Brooks, single mother. Sergeant Lionel Green, veteran, dozens. Then hundreds. A quiet crowd had gathered, children holding parents' hands, old men in faded caps, high schoolers still in uniform from a morning football game. At the base of the wall, carved in steel, were the words, "To those who never made the headlines but built the ground we walk on." No ribbon, no cameras, no podium. JD arrived just past sunset, stepping out of a plain black sedan. He didn't wear a suit, no aides flanked him. Just him, a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket, and the Purple Heart ribbon still tucked into his inner lining. People didn't rush him. A few nodded, some looked away. There was no ceremony, just a shared silence that didn't need explanation. He walked slowly toward the wall. His fingers brushed each name he passed as if memorizing them by feel. When he reached the center, he stopped, looked for a long time, then wordlessly laid his hand on the stone. And he stayed that way, not to be seen, not to be heard, just to remember. A child nearby whispered to her father, "Is he going to say something?" The father knelt, shook his head softly. He already did. The sun dipped lower, casting the wall in a soft orange glow. Light caught on the names, making them shimmer briefly, like stars that had always been there. But no one had looked up long enough to notice. JD turned after a few minutes, nodded once to a passing veteran, and walked back to his car without saying a word. And still, no one erased a name. The sky had faded to deep indigo, and the streetlights blinked on with a warm, hesitant glow. JD walked alone down a narrow brick-lined street on the outskirts of town. His coat collar was turned up against the soft evening wind, and with each step, his shoes tapped gently on the pavement, a rhythm only he seemed to hear. There was no entourage, no press car trailing behind, no headlines waiting to be written, just the sound of distant cicadas and the faint clink of a wind chime swaying on someone's porch. He paused outside a corner store, the kind that still kept handwritten signs taped to the windows. Through the glass, a woman in an apron was restocking shelves. She looked up briefly, recognition flashing in her eyes, but said nothing. JD gave a small nod and kept walking. As he passed the old elementary school, a boy on a bike rode up from behind. Probably no more than 10 or 11, the boy wobbled slightly as he slowed beside him. "Hey," the kid said almost shyly, then steadied his handlebars and looked up. "You're the guy who stood up, right?" JD stopped, looked at the boy, really looked at him, freckles across his cheeks, a backpack swinging loosely behind. He smiled faintly. "Maybe." The boy didn't ask for a selfie, didn't ask for a name. He just grinned, gave a small wave, and pedaled off into the darkening street. JD watched him go, then stood still a moment longer, letting the quiet settle around him. The wind picked up slightly, and with it came the soft scent of rain on warm pavement. He resumed walking, hands in his coat pockets, head slightly bowed, not in defeat, but in reflection. And as the night folded around him, a final voiceover rose, low and steady. Maybe I didn't change the world, but I reminded it who it left behind. Fade to black. Silence. Then just as the screen lingers, a soft echo of the boy's voice again, somewhere distant but unforgettable. You're the guy who stood up. What resonates most in this story is its quiet strength, the idea that true impact doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through small gestures, through names unspoken, and lives unseen. JD didn't chase applause. He carried stories that others tried to forget. The boy on the bike wasn't just recognizing a man, he was recognizing a moment. A moment where someone stood when silence was easier. In a world flooded with noise and performance, maybe the most radical thing is to simply show up, with memory, with humility, and with truth. Question for you. Have you ever witnessed a small act of courage that changed the way you saw the world, even if just for a moment? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.